So it's not often that we do podcasts where we have multiple guests. But today we have multiple guests because both of these guests are vehemently against the sustainable use of wildlife. Right, Patrick?
Oh, 100.
The worst.
The worst. These people are the
barely
worst.
pass the meat aisle when I'm looking for my vegan hamburgers.
Yeah, exactly. No, today's podcast is going to be pretty amazing. I've got, first I'll introduce the chair of the board. You have been on the podcast before. You are an old hat to the podcast, Christy Plott. Christy, introduce yourself and what you do. And
well, I'm Gilmore now is my last name.
That's right, Christy Plott Gilmore. That's right.
Yeah. And I own an alligator and crocodile leather tannery with my family. The business is 100 years old. We supply exotic leather to manufacturers and brands around the world. In addition to that, I am the industry chair for the IUCN Crocodile Specialist Group, which is the largest and most important crocodilian conservation group in the world, made up of a network of about 800 biologists, ecologists, zoologists, and people far more educated than me. And I am the industry chair. And I'm also a board member of the International Crocodilian Farmers Association, where we work to enhance and improve animal welfare standards for crocodilians around the world. And we also do a lot of research. Let's see.
Sounds like do a bit of everything.
But it's all in the realm of croc conservation.
Okay. Patrick?
Cool. Thanks, Robbie. So I guess at heart, I'm a reptile geek. I have been since I was about 3 years old. The natural progression from being a reptile geek is to get into the profession of wildlife conservation. So by training, I'm a conservation biologist. I hold a PhD in the conservation and sustainable use of crocodiles. I started my career, born and bred in Africa, raised in Africa, schooled in Africa. I started my career working with large carnivores here in Botswana, in the Okavango swamps, working with wild dogs and lions, and then found an opportunity to move into my preferred line of speciality, which is reptiles. I ran the world's largest reptile zoo in India for a couple of years. And then I moved over to Southeast Asia, where I've been working for the last 15 years or so on various reptile conservation and sustainable use projects. Based on my experiences there and the sort of conservation successes we saw unfold there, or at least sustainable development successes unfold there, we decided to move back to Africa, where we are now in the process of sort of cookie cutting those successes and rolling them out in the African context.
Where did you do your PhD?
Where I am now.
Where did you do your PhD, Patrick?
I actually did it through Imperial College in London, but all my field work was done in Africa.
Yeah, cool, man. The only reason I asked that question is when I was a honors and master's student at Wits in Joburg, I had this, I don't know if Christy knows this story, I had this innate fear of snakes. Like I did not like snakes. And there was a professor there, the herpetology professor at Wits at the time was Graham Alexander.
I actually did my postdoc with Graham. I did a postdoc with him. So him and I are very good friends.
Small world. And he said to me,
your fears of snakes are not unfounded. Pat, show him your fingers.
Yeah, no, there's some truth to running away when you see a snake.
For those of you that are not on YouTube and not watching this live through a video, Patrick just pointed his index finger that is not there. I remember he said, "Oh, don't worry, I'm going to cure your fear of snakes very quickly." He took me down to the herpetology room, and there were 40 one-week-old African rock pythons that needed their cages cleaned. And he goes, I need you to take all these snakes out of these cages. And little did he tell me that the African rock python, when it's a week old, is the bitiest snake probably in the world. And got smashed African rock pythons on my hands, and got over my fear a little bit. And then I think a couple of weeks later, he was doing a big telemetry study on African rock pythons at the time, and he said to me, he called me, he says, "Hey, I need some help moving a snake." Things didn't translate in my brain. Like, why do you need help moving a snake? Come down, there's this huge metal trommel that's probably, 40 inches by 30 inches by 30 inches deep. And he opens it, and there is one snake inside it. And it filled up the container. Okay, this was Big Bertha. She was 57 kilos, so 125, 128 pounds of snake. And he said, "Listen, I'm going to distract her. You grab the head." And I was like, "What?"
Man.
And yeah, we released Big Bertha. We put him in a surgical suite. It was amazing experience. But anyway, that's my background to reptiles and whatnot.
So,
So
Robbie, answer this. Did your fear morph into a phobia, or are you now comfortable around snakes?
very, very comfortable around snakes.
Good.
If I see a snake, I don't run from it. I'm more curious than anything, obviously with a healthy respect. And here's the other thing. When I landed to do my PhD in the United States, I landed in a field station in Mississippi that used to be an old minnow farm. And so you could imagine, I'm a wetland ecologist now. That's what I did as a PhD and a master's. Very few snakes in Kruger did we didn't encounter very many snakes in Kruger. But during my PhD, this minnow farm had 240 ponds. They did a herpetology study out there, and they caught 40 times more cottonmouths than all other snake species combined. And so every pond you were in, every ditch I was in, there were literally cottonmouths within yards of you constantly. So no, I quite enjoy the herpetology side of things. I obviously don't do much of that anymore. So let's start this sort of the line of where we're going with this conversation. Patrick, I'll start with you. This idea that you have, that you're now translating from Southeast Asia into Africa. What is it? What is that idea?
So Southeast Asia, Robbie, as I'm sure you and your listeners know, it's a very old part of the world in terms of human civilization, and there's a very long history of wildlife utilization in that part of the world. And being a quintessentially tropical region, reptiles feature heavily within that sort of band of species that are utilized heavily. And so,
and in terms of utilization, what are they being utilized for? Mainly food?
Everything.
Okay.
Food, materials, medicines, cultural artifacts of some sort of significance, all manner of bits and bobs. So the number of species they utilize and the purposes of those, why they utilize them, are almost infinite. And of course, it varies from one country to another, from one culture to another across that landscape. So it really is. It's a story in its own right. I mean, we could be here for days just talking about the utilization of reptiles in Southeast Asia. But of course, over time, those populations of those species have come under pressure because of the burgeoning population in that part of the world, and particularly the growing affluence. And so what we see emerging over the last sort of 10, 20, 30 years is more sophisticated utilization programs involving those species, all the way from wild harvests, all the way through to emerging production systems and the farming of certain species. And that's really where I spent my time working at the coalface, with the wild harvests, but also, with everything in between and up to farming systems. And one of the things that emerged quite quickly early on in my experiences is just why these farmers were turning to these species particularly under challenging circumstances. And as it transpired, it turned out that reptiles just have the edge over other agricultural species or other species that are being utilized from the wild in so many different areas. And that stretches from zoonotic diseases like we see with bird flu and swine flu. So a lot of the farmers, for example, in Vietnam that were getting hit with annual outbreaks and quarantines and culling with their poultry and pork, they were turning to reptiles because they just
it wasn't
don't get
happening
the same...
on the reptile side, right?
No, of course not, because they're cold-blooded animals. They have a completely different suite of diseases to ourselves, and so there was no risk. So when the quarantines came down, they didn't apply to reptiles. As a group of animals, they tend to be very resilient. Essentially, in order for them to evolve alongside high-performance warm-blooded animals like birds and mammals, they've more or less evolved to occupy those resource-deficient niches around birds and mammals. So they're quite good on living on very little food and water relative to birds and mammals, and also surviving the lean periods much better than birds and mammals. And those adaptations translate very readily into an agricultural setting. And so a lot of these small-scale farmers were realizing quite quickly that, wow, we really are struggling to make a living from poultry, from pigs, from cattle, goats. But here we've got a species that actually meets our situation, our particular circumstances. It's not getting the diseases. We can do it with very little resources, very little space. We don't have to worry about when our rice fields get flooded and salinization makes them redundant, or economic shutdowns. We could just switch off our little reptile farm and it can last for months without any inputs at all. And we know that we don't have to worry about selling that product because they can sit. They have an adaptive metabolic physiology that allows them to just sit for months without losing any weight or condition. So that's what we found. It's just there were a whole lot of little applications that were really working well in different contexts and different areas for different people. And we just sort of realized, well, hang on a second. Africa suffers from a very similar suite of challenges. And it also has a cultural precedent for reptiles, although very few people don't see it because it's been overshadowed by Africa's wealth of large mammalian vertebrates, for example.
Right.
But certainly in parts of West and Central Africa, reptiles are as much a part of the daily fare as any other animal. So
Patrick,
we
in terms of the reptiles, what kind of what type of reptiles are the Southeast guys? Is it everything? Is it snakes, lizards, crocodilian species? Is it everything?
Literally everything. They're farming little skinks, little lizards, and everything right up to giant king cobras and the world's biggest pythons, and everything in between. And it extends to other, to turtles and tortoises, crocodilians, you name it, they're farming it, just because they're realizing that there are these little edges that they have, and it's giving them, it's allowing their agricultural systems to be more productive. It's allowing their wild harvests to be more productive.
Wouldn't you, in my brain, and I'd like, Patrick, you answer, and then Christy, you can add to it. In my brain, though, this system, again, I'm coming at it from a complete outsider. I know nothing about the system. But in my brain, as you start seeing potential in these reptilian species, the agricultural production value of them goes up. In other wildlife systems, it's meant disaster for the wild system, because now it's tragedy of the commons, which is I'm going out, I'm taking as much as I can from the wild, because if I don't get it, my neighbor's going to get it, and so let's go and get it. Is that happening?
Yeah,
Is the wild population suffering because of this new thought process?
Okay, so that's an interesting question, and that's why we do need an hour to chat about this, because there's a lot more to it that needs to be explained before you can see why it works so well. So reptiles are, at least a lot, and certainly the vast majority of the main species that are being utilized in Southeast Asia have a very fast life history. So they grow very quickly. They're very fecund. They have a very high reproductive output. I mean, a python can lay 40 eggs every year, provided there's enough food and warmth. And that can keep going for 20 years or more. And so they tend to be extraordinarily abundant when conditions are right for them. Now, if you can imagine, large parts of Southeast Asia and East Asia comprise very fertile landscapes. If we take Indonesia, for example, they've got the added bonus of volcanic soils. But elsewhere across Southeast Asia, typically it's high rainfall, relatively fertile soils, and very productive agricultural landscapes. Whether it be rice or palm oil, whatever the case is, it's fairly productive. The population, the human population is very high. It's a fairly intensive agriculture. And in terms of wildlife, there's not much that can tolerate that level of anthropogenic pressure. But reptiles are different. And they're different for a number of reasons. One is they've got this very fast life history. So they're already well suited to sustainable use, to high levels of harvest. They also tend to be fairly cryptic. So, for example, pythons tend to spend an awful lot of time just sitting doing nothing. They're sessile organisms. They spend their life in ambush or underground or high up in trees. And a lot of other of the heavily utilized species are the same. They have this, we know now from radiotelemetry studies, they have this incredible ability to live in very close proximity to humans without ever being detected. Getting back to your cottonmouth story, that's why you have so many cottonmouths living in a minnow farm. You know, they just, you wouldn't see them unless you're jumping in those ponds. And then lastly, they have this unique ability to survive the hyperbolic ecology of agricultural landscapes. So agricultural landscapes are feast or famine. Sometimes there's an abundance of food, but other times for many months there may be nothing when it's just a field waiting to be sowed. Now, there are very few animals that can cope with that hyperbolic ecology. But one group of animals is insects, and particularly your insect pests. They do really well in that landscape. And another group of animals is your rodent pests. They tend to do very well in those landscapes because they can respond quickly. Now, reptiles have the perfect suite of attributes that allow them to track those boom and bust cycles of insects and rodents. So I guess in many respects they're the equivalent of your wild pigs in the south of the US. They're doing really well in these agricultural landscapes, and so they can tolerate these super high levels of harvesting. Now,
It's interesting. It's interesting you say that, because I think everybody, me especially, and I'm a scientist. I've got a PhD. I actually thought it was the opposite. And what you've just said is makes it even better from a story perspective, because you have this push when it comes to sustainable use of animals. And Christy, you can speak to this in Louisiana specifically when it comes to wetlands and alligators. That if you lose the wild habitat writ large across most all wildlife species, human pressure, anthropomorphic pressure on the habitats results in a decrease in wildlife, results in a decrease in biodiversity, abundance, whatnots. But the way that you just laid it out, Patrick, is that these reptile species in the southeast, in Southeast Asia specifically, and maybe in other scenarios, are perfectly adapted to anthropomorphic pressure and could actually thrive in these heavily human impacted systems like agricultural systems, pushing habitat out, decreasing habitat, because you've got nooks and crannies, you've got ditches, you've got banks, you've got all sorts of things where these things can live and, as you said, be cryptic.
Yeah. And Robbie, I mean, you'll know the story of your pythons in the Florida Everglades. You know, it doesn't matter how many millions of dollars you throw at that problem, you're never going to get rid of those animals. They're going to do really well there. They're going to be at a really high abundance level, although you won't see very many. The fact of the matter is there's millions of tons of python protein crawling around in that ecosystem, you know, that if you can get your hands on it, it could be a very valuable source of food, you know.
Mm-hmm. 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 So in South Africa, you're going to try and utilize the same methodology, just using some of the reptile species there?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, Africa has a wealth of reptile species, as I'm sure you know, and they've never been explored in any scientific capacity in terms of their agricultural or wild harvest potential. And so that's more or less what we're doing. We're looking at all of our indigenous species, particularly those that have similar traits, biological traits, to those that are already farmed very successfully in Asia. And and then we're looking at different production systems for different contexts within Africa.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Christy, from a crocodilian alligator perspective, obviously wise use, sustainable use has been a foundational pillar in the restoration of crocodilian and alligator species across the world, right?
Yeah. So I'll use the example in the United States. In the 1960s, there were less than 100,000 animals, American alligators in the wild. Today, there are probably close to 5 million across the southeastern United States. In Louisiana alone, it is a very conservative estimate to say that there are 3.5 million alligators in the wild, which is, it may not seem like a lot, but when you put it next to the fact that there are only 5 million people living in the state, it's pretty incredible. So the way the program in Louisiana works, it's a little different. And the farming or ranching, as it's technically called, of alligators has actually increased the population. That's how the population has rebounded so successfully. So
how is that possible?
So
how can farming increase a wild population?
So it's interesting. So because an alligator egg is very susceptible to predation, it's very susceptible to flooding. In nature, I would say, 95% or more of those eggs in a nest would die. I think an average size of a clutch of alligator eggs is about 30, 32, 35 eggs. Can be more or less. But 95% of those would never hatch. So farmers make contracts with landowners and the state. It's a three-way contract between the government, the landowner, and the farmer or the rancher. And the farmer goes into the marsh. He collects 100% of the eggs. He pays the landowner for 100% of those eggs. So he is buying something from that landowner that would have died naturally. So that landowner is getting paid. This puts millions and millions of dollars annually into the pockets of landowners. Now, only 6% of the earth is covered in wetlands, and it is the fastest disappearing ecosystem on the planet. In coastal Louisiana, over 80% of those wetlands are owned by private individuals, making the revenue that goes to the landowners very important, because otherwise, they don't have ways to maintain their wetland. And when you take a look at the weather systems in Louisiana, you can understand why that's important, because hurricanes will go through and they will completely tear up the marsh. They will push sediment, which closes water flow. It will wash marsh away. So restoration projects are very important, and that is what preserves the habitat. And the landowners do it because they know that their source of revenue depends on the sale of alligator eggs. And alligators are not fish. They don't nest in water. They need land to nest. So there's tons of restoration projects that are happening. After the farmers take 100% of the eggs back to their farm, they typically get about a 95 to 97% hatch rate. And then they grow that animal.
What's the typical hatch rate in the wild? Do we know?
Less than 5%.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, very, very low. And that's mostly because of flooding and predation. And so the farmers get a very high hatch rate, and they raise the animal to between 3 and 4 feet in length, and then they release a percentage of those hatched back to that original landowner's property. Now, in the inception of the farming program, the releases, I believe, were around 22%.
Right.
And then they've gradually tapered off. And today the release is 5% back to the wild, and they just recently changed it from 10% to 5%. So 10% of what was hatched was being released back to that landowner, and now it's dropped down to 5. But that has basically bolstered the populations, and that's why we have such incredible rebounds of this species. So it's
So has that example been replicated elsewhere? I believe like the Northern Territory saltwater crocodile is the same model, right?
Pat, I'll let you take this
Yeah,
one, Pat.
no, absolutely, and different versions of it. There's different ways you can cut that particular cake, but more or less that sustainable use program is rolled out with many different species of crocodilians and indeed some species of reptiles as well, of snakes as well. So, yeah, and it's proved equally successful, albeit for different reasons, in other parts of the world. So, for example, in Africa and in South America, it puts money in the hands of those local communities that are custodians of that landscape. And it preserves different kinds of ecosystems, not necessarily threatened wetlands, but it helps provide incentives for conserving otherwise dangerous animals that are threatening your livelihood, so on and so forth.
So, interestingly, a couple of days ago, so people will date when we're recording this podcast, I did a piece on rhino trade. I just put a little Sunday thoughts, musings out. Patrick, I think you saw that on LinkedIn. And a guy messaged me on LinkedIn. And it's like, I don't want to publicly say this. It's all about different NGOs of rhinos. And, they are pro-conservation of rhino, but anti-trade. And I said, well, then are they technically pro-conservation if they're anti-trade? Because it's bad for business if that species is doing well, And he mentioned a crocodilian example in that message. And I'll just throw it to you and you tell me. He said something, and again, I haven't researched it at all. I'm just taking at face value what he said. The Siamese crocodile has more than 1 million in captivity, but less than 1,000 in the wild. And I was like, is that true? Like, what's going on there?
It's true. And the reason for that is because of lack of public tolerance.
Yeah.
Pat can probably speak more to this, but, in some cultures, crocodiles are considered somewhat demonic or evil. So the people, if they have had, people that have been attacked or they've seen people killed by crocodiles, and it's quite a brutal death, to be killed by a crocodile. And so the people, if they have
you should see the videos that come into my phone of Zimbabwe man eaters. Oh.
But you have to alongside with, you have to make the value of the species for the local community. So, in Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory or in Papua New Guinea, the local people are the ones who benefited from collecting the eggs. They were the ones that would collect the crocodile eggs and sell them. For every crocodile egg they collected, they were given 2 chicken eggs and they were paid. So they said, wow, this is a great system. The same thing in Kenya, in the Tana River Basin. The people there were being decimated by crocodiles. I mean, I'm not saying they were being completely wiped out. It's a little exaggeration, but, they were poisoning crocodiles because they didn't want them around. So when they were able to start having financial incentives to support their lives, they said, hey, wait a minute, let's not kill these. Let's keep these around. And I think that in the countries where the Siamese crocodile has lived, those benefits were not introduced. There was no ranching systems per se. Those animals are bred in closed-looped captive systems, so the only people that are benefiting from that species are the people that own the farm and the people that work on the farm, and it is not the local communities that are benefiting. And I think that that's the difference. You have to have.
So there's no like wild harvest, Pat, of them going out getting eggs and feeling inclusive. The community going, okay, we're gonna shift our cultural mistrust or cultural traditions around this because we see the economic value tied to this animal.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess the Siamese crocodile is it's slightly a unique case because bear in mind the natural distribution of the species, or at least the natural habitat, involves key wetland ecosystems that happen to be the cradle of civilization in that part of the world. So Tonle Sap Lake and various other like hyper productive landscapes where you've had ancient civilizations occupying the core habitat for millennia. And so already at the turn of the last century, the species was already being pushed into the marginal habitat on the periphery. And really, it's been in competition with humans for a very, very long time. Add on top of that a sort of a level of illegal wild harvest specifically for the leather trade. It wasn't a major factor, but it did, because the population was already marginal, it did sort of tip it towards the negative. But really, the interesting side to that story is the fact that had those agricultural landscapes managed to find value for that crocodile 1,000 years ago, maybe we would see more of the natural habitat today, whereas now it's just rice and then it goes up into the hills and the steep ravines.
It's funny you say that. It's funny the way that you just couched that. I'm reading a book right now called, gosh, I can't remember. It's hands down. I'll send a picture to you. It's about the whole Kenyan, Tanzanian wildlife shift, 1987, 1988, 1989, the whole ascendance of AWF and WWF and the banning of ivory trade and whatnot. It's very similar to what we're talking about here. And in this book, there are a couple of strong ecologists and conservationists that were very big proponents of the Africans themselves being allowed to hunt elephants leaving Tsavo or hunt rhinos leaving Tsavo, because they would then culturally have seen the value in these animals and probably would have stymied the massive poaching crisis that happened in the late 70s, early 80s leading up to this ban, because they wouldn't have allowed it.
100%.
That's one of the things that in Louisiana, for example, there are hundreds of thousands of acres of marsh. You can't have a game warden on that many places at that many times. It is the landowner that polices poaching. You better believe that a landowner is going to turn in a poacher if he sees someone hunting an alligator, or a duck or whatever it is on his land. He's going to turn them in immediately, because to him, that is stealing. That is stealing a resource from him. It is just as valuable to him as the money that is in his bank account. And when you have the local communities engaged, they are your biggest ally to stop poaching.
All right, so let me ask this question. If, we've set the scene here, sustainable use works. Sustainable use of reptilians work. I believe sustainable use of wildlife writ large works. Is there an example in your community, and let's be honest for a second, in the crocodilian reptilian community, in which sustainable use has not worked?
Robbie, that's an interesting question, because philosophically, I think success depends on a series of experiences that may include failure.
Well, let me be more specific. Has resulted in the decline of a wildlife species that's being used.
I mean, certainly in the past, there are a lot of examples. For example, with crocodilians in particular, where the big boom, post-war boom in exotic leather fashion, resulted in the overharvest of certain populations.
Yeah, but Patrick, that's not sustainable use. That was more unregulated commercial harvest.
This is what I'm saying. We know that theoretically we can overutilize them, and we have done in the past. But the moment you inject a modicum of sensible management, you see the exact flip side. And as I tried to explain, not very well in the beginning, these animals are incredibly well suited to sustainable use. So you give them half an inch, and the populations are away. So I could sit here now and I could say, look, when you look at a handful of species, small island endemics. There are a couple of, for the pet trade and that sort of thing, there are a couple of examples. But when you look at the millions of individual reptiles that are utilized across the tropics on an annual basis from a whole suite of different species, no, I can't. There's just no examples, and certainly nothing like you'll see in the mammals or the birds, comparatively.
I think what it ties back to is overexploitation can happen, but like Pat said, the minute that you start to put, framework around it, sound wildlife management, oversight, government oversight, and buy-in from industry, it's going to work. If you were to just have, for example, Louisiana, which was completely and totally unregulated, I think that you would see, you would never have seen those animals rebound. But it's, they're doing the aerial nest surveys. They know about how many animals are in the marsh. They're doing egg collection quotas, so you can only collect what the government says you can collect in those marsu's. And then, of course, there's strict oversight and all kinds of checks that the government is doing and working alongside industry. I was able to speak at the United Nations World Wildlife Day about this, which was really cool because it was an interesting, I guess, oxymoron to most people, or I don't know what the word would be, but it was interesting to most people because they think, oh, World Wildlife Day, that is about saving animals. And here I was up on the stage talking about, alligator handbags and cowboy boots, and that's how you save animals. And that it was only because of the partnership between government, i.e. CITES, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, industry, people like me, people like other tanneries, brands like Hermes or Lucchese, and then it's, of course, buy-in as well from scientists, folks like Patrick. So when you have all three of those working together, beautiful things can happen because everyone there wants the same thing to happen. You just have to find a way to do it. Everybody wants species to increase and habitats to be saved. You just have to find a way to do it. And industry has been the best way to have the money to do it because government doesn't always have the money. Scientists definitely don't have the money. So who has it? Industry. So they're the ones that put all of the money in. And as a matter of fact, the entire management program, the entire alligator program is funded 100% by tag fees, which means it's funded by industry. Demand in alligator is what pays for all of the wildlife management costs in the state of Louisiana. It's not funded by taxpayers.
So I'll ask one specific question to Patrick, and then I want to ask a more challenging question. Patrick, do you think, and it's interesting, again, I should remember this bloody title of this book because I'm reading it right now and I'm halfway through it and it's just fascinating because it's literally like you could pick it up and put it right now, right? It's the same rhetoric 40 years later. And in it, it is very clear that they say most conservationists, if not all of the conservationists, were against a ban. We're against a ban of trade. In your field, Patrick, are there conservationists that are against what you are proposing?
Look, Robbie, for any conservationist worth their weight, completely gets it. It's not a question of debate. It's a very simple concept that just works in the real world situation. So definitely not. Any meaningful conservation working at the cold fronts of wildlife conservation, particularly in the global south and in the tropics, there's no other way. Building wildlife economies is the only way forward.
Yep. So, again, speaking to this book, all the conservationists said, do not ban. Do not do what you're about to do. And NGOs, anti-use people, politicals, and most importantly, people in the fundraising game for the anti-use establishment said we need to ban because it's going to be good for us. And so, regardless of whether it's good for wildlife or not, and pushed this rhetoric. Well, we just saw that same thing happen, which is what led us to being on this podcast together. London Fashion Week said we're pulling all, just correct me if I'm wrong here, Christy, all reptilian leathers, all exotic leathers from the Fashion Week. And the question is why? And maybe this is just a bigger writ large question for even 40 years ago, right? Why is there this massive disconnect? And maybe the answer is, Robbie, it doesn't really matter what we say. Maybe it's how we say it. Maybe it's the tactics we use and how we describe what's actually happening on the ground to convince these people, or the people on the other side, maybe not the fundraisers, that you're making just a horrible decision.
I think the people who are making these decisions, the closest they've come to the type of wildlife that they're banning is the Discovery Channel or Animal Planet.
Oh, again, this book says they've never stepped foot in Africa and they're banning rhino horn.
They don't know. They don't understand the way the programs work. They're complicated. It's all, scientifically managed. It would be like explaining to someone who is a reptile farmer in Southeast Asia or someone who works on an alligator farm in Louisiana why a dress that is made of cotton would cost $4,000. They don't understand it. They don't understand the technical threads and the work and all of that goes into it. They don't get it. So, there has to be some level of coming together and understanding on this. I think that the problem is lack of education, and they think the people at London Fashion Week think they're educated about it because an NGO has shown them a video. And so we, as society today, we feel like we watch one video and there's a narrator that sounds like they're important and they've got, words on the bottom and they tell you a story. And we think, that's it, we've got it. But the story that they're being told is not the truth. The story that they're being told is these poor animals are exploited for fashion. It's wrong. It's vanity. Well, there's a flip side to that. There's a flip side in the fact that these people are investing in the conservation of these species. They are improving local communities. And, if London Fashion Week actually took a look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals and they looked at the reptile industry and they were to see how many of those UN Sustainable Development Goals that we are actually reaching and improving upon, I think that they would have a different take on it. The issue is that London Fashion Week doesn't want to listen to a Robbie Kroger or a Pat Aust or a Christy Gilmore. They want to listen to someone who walks into their office in their concrete jungle and who shows them a video. Well, we've not done all of those videos in the way that these other groups have, and that's what we're going to have to start doing.
Mm-hmm. No, 100%. And and that's our whole mantra.
It's like lobbying.
No, exactly. It's lobbying, and it's also thinking outside the box, right? It's at the next London Fashion Week, whenever that is in 2025, whatever, right? Let's find a billboard that's super close, and we fucking put a billboard up.
Absolutely. And what Christy says is 100% right. I mean, it's just a very, very simple case of the animal rights lobby. It's a very successful business model. They're just a lot louder and a lot more in the face of the decision makers than we are. And that is all it is. And it's a misinformation game, of the next level. It's just a case of they spout a narrative that has no foundation in science and especially no foundation in the frontline realities of what's going on in the real world. But that doesn't matter.
Pat, I have a question for you. Have you once ever seen an animal rights NGO, whether it be Humane Society International or Born Free or PETA or whatever. I mean, PETA's a little extreme. They're really, but have you ever seen them there, like where you've been at the coal face of conservation, doing the field work? I'm just curious, like, because I've never
Christy,
seen Louisiana.
that is a really good point, because let me tell you something right now. They're here, but they're here for one reason only, and that's to grab the headlines of the work someone else is doing. The reason why they're not at the front line, the reason why they're not investing in long-term projects of their own, is simply because their modus operandi has a complete disconnect with the realities of the way conservation works on the ground. You see it all the time. When a community sees a conservation organization spending millions of dollars getting a zebra foal with a broken leg fixed, and then that going wrong, and then having a prosthetic leg made for the zebra, they just sit there scratching their head and saying, I've just lost my third child to malaria. All I needed was a little bit of treatment that costs a fraction of what you've just spent on that zebra.
Mm-hmm.
So that is why these animal rights organizations cannot do long-term work on the ground, because their whole philosophy is just out of touch with what's happening on the ground.
I mean, I've never seen, any of these organizations actually invest. And this is just from my perspective. I've never seen them actually invest in conservation programs. I've never seen them donate to, for example, the IUCN Croc Specialist Group, where we're doing research on critically endangered species. What I have seen is industry invest in that. I have seen industry invest in research programs on species that have never been used by industry, are never going to be used. For example, like the Indian gharial. We're funding research on that. It's coming from people who use them. It's coming from zoos. It's coming from industry, and so I've just not seen it. So I was just curious.
Who are the big anti-use players in this reptilian space?
PETA
PETA is the biggest one?
Yeah, PETA, Humane Society.
Does I4 play at all? I4 plays too?
Defenders
They do. They're not nearly as vocal as PETA or Humane Society.
Okay.
Defenders of Wildlife.
Just so you'll know.
Yeah, Defenders of Wildlife was a thorn in our side because they wrote an illegal trade report. It was completely full.
Oh, I remember that.
It was so wrong. It was so bad. It was, like, I wish that these documents that these groups had to do was put under peer review, because anybody would say this is a bunch of garbage. So, it's just interesting because, they hold themselves up as scientific organizations, but what they're looking for, they have a point of view, and they're just putting information together from bits and pieces of data that support their point of view. That is it's completely and totally incorrect. So, but they are better funded than us. I can remember being in the 7th grade, and like, I had a t-shirt that said, "Give wildlife a chance." God knows who it funded. I don't know. I don't have a clue who it funded, but I will guarantee you that it did not fund anyone who is on the ground or any, I think it was sold at our school as a school fundraiser for some animal rights group, probably. I'm ashamed to say that I had that t-shirt.
Listen, you've reformed. It's okay. It's okay. Since you were 7, it's okay. We forgive you. Yeah, it's amazing, man. And as Patrick said, I think we could talk for hours and hours about this, and I have some ideas of how we can do that, and I'll talk to you guys off air about that.
Guys, just quickly, Robbie, I've got a hard stop at the end of the hour. I've got another meeting starting. Is that all right?
We're about done, brother. You're about done.
Cool.
Cool.
Did you? I know we struggled to get together on this, but I think it's an important topic. I think there's lots of important topics surrounding this. I think there's some really good educational pieces that obviously maybe have been explored or maybe have not been explored in the right way, that I'd love to explore with you guys. But I know we've coordinated 3 different time zones to get this podcast at the same time, so that's great. Christy, appreciate you. Patrick, pleasure to meet you finally face to face. And if there's anything we can do to help, please don't hesitate to reach out. You know how to get a hold of us now.
Cool. Well, Robbie, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to chat a bit about this. It's a subject very close to my heart. But
yeah, and you have a straight into the chair of the board if you need anything to be done. So, all right, guys, thanks.
You and I have had many late nights discussing these issues.
Oh, I'm sure.
We've solved them
Saving the
all by
world.
the end of the night.
Perfect.
Thanks, Robbie.
And we'll do the same with you, no doubt. One day, Robbie, we'll definitely hook up. And certainly, if you're ever in this part of the world, please do know that you've got a bed and a place to stay.
Appreciate that.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate the talk this morning.